Good afternoon or morning, wherever you are, and welcome to this webinar organised by Resilience First in partnership with McKinsey. For those of you who weren't able to view the opening video, Resilience First's mission is to help build resilience in business communities. So those communities be defined by geography or special interest. As we all struggle to manage the Covid-19 crisis, not to mention the growing climate crisis, and with Brexit looming, then focus has rightly turned to the notion of being more resilient, both personally and professionally. Within that concept of surviving and thriving, which is our motto, efforts to build back, the government's motto, then one particular aspect comes to the fore, and that's the principle of agility. One is agile in mind and management, then it should be possible to bounce forward from a difficult situation and show that flexibility and adaptation can overcome current and anticipated problems. Hence, we've organised today's webinar to shed some light on certain aspects of the agility agenda, how it relates to resilience and what it means for businesses and communities. I think Bill Gates got it right when he said, success today requires the agility and drive to constantly rethink, reinvigorate, react, and reinvent. In fact, that's a great definition of resilience in the round, with agility at the core. This webinar reflects the excellent work undertaken by people at McKinsey on the subject. So back in the late summer, McKinsey conducted a survey of a number of top Resilience First members on agility and produced a sterling report entitled Agile Resilience, Lessons from COVID-19 for the Next Normal, which is available on our website. The report was a study on the relationship between existing agile working practices and strengthening business resiliency tested against the backdrop of the pandemic. The survey and subsequent report identified 5 emerging themes, and it's that content that we would like to share with you this afternoon. Now, to do so, we are fortunate to have 3 of the survey's respondents on today's webinar. But first, an overview of the report will be provided by McKinsey, which in turn will be introduced by our chairman for the session, Chris Hanscom, partner at McKinsey. You'll find details of Chris's biography and those of the other speakers in your joining instructions. And I would say, however, that the current focus of Chris's work is on how energy companies can design and implement more agile organizations. So he's being personally agile by chairing our session today, for which we are very grateful. Now, before handing proceedings to the chair, I will invite all of you to ask questions of the speakers throughout the session by posting short written questions in the chat box to the right of your screen. I'm sure the chair will pick up as many as he can in the Q&A questions. For the speakers, could I ask you to turn the mics and cameras off when you're not speaking or in panel? And besides that, Chris, the virtual floor is yours.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining. We're pleased to have you join us today and to see such great interest in this important topic. I'm Christopher Hanscom, a partner with McKinsey and Company based in our London office, and I'm a leader of our global work on agility and agile organizations. I've also been leading our collaboration with Resilience First over the past year. Agility, and especially agility as it relates to organizational adaptability and resilience, is a true area of passion for me. Before I go any further, let me introduce my colleague, Elena Chong. Elena is an engagement manager with me at McKinsey, and she led the research we're going to be talking about today, and we'll be talking about that in just a minute. Our ingoing hypothesis for this research was that there is a link between agility and resilience, namely that organizations that are more agile are also more resilient and have a greater capacity to adapt to change. So we decided to test this, and Elena will take you through what we did and what we found. Perhaps worth pausing for just a second for a word on definitions. When we talk about agility, we broadly mean responding to change over following a plan. You might choose to talk about adaptation or adaptive capacity, but we're talking about the same. Agile organizations, as we think of them, combine the efficiencies of scale with speed, flexibility, and resilience. And they do this by combining stable and dynamic elements. Stable elements provide direction and an efficient and scalable backbone for an organization. Whereas then a network of dynamic teams sits on top of that enables organizations to radically increase speed, flexibility, empowerment, and ownership. These stable and dynamic elements in a truly agile organization reinforce one another, and they're both essential for organizational agility. Now, going back to our hypothesis, we did indeed find through the work that organizations who adopted agile practices during COVID-19 were better able to weather the disruption caused by the pandemic and demonstrated greater resilience. Elena will go into more detail about the specific practices and agile characteristics we found commonly came up in interviews and the research, and the lessons that other companies can take for the next normal when it comes. So without further ado, let me hand over to Elena to talk through the key findings from the study and learn 5 more on those 5 crucial takeaways to help you reinforce your business's ability to bounce forward in the face of the crisis. Elena.
Thanks, Christopher. Would we be able to pull up the presentation slides, please? I assume everyone can see the slides now. Great. So as Christopher said, we had a hypothesis that there is a link between agility and resilience, and that agility can boost an organization's resilience and capacity to adapt to change. And to test this hypothesis, we partnered with Resilience First to conduct research with their members and supplemented that with broader international research from McKinsey. For our research partnership with Resilience First, we interviewed executives at a number of member organizations to understand how they had fared in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of those we interviewed today are joining me on the panel. Through our interviews, we found that many of the organizations had shown great resilience to the pandemic, and that they had done that by taking on a few common practices. These practices aligned well with the typical trademarks of agile organizations. In effect, COVID-19 had prompted many companies to become more agile, with greater adaptive capacity, and they were consequently more resilient as a result. In a few minutes, I'll take you through the specific practices we found. But I also wanted to touch briefly on the research that we did. The broader research, which was conducted with lots of different organizations internationally. This research shows that many organizations witnessed performance leaps during the pandemic, while focusing on an essential core of activities and competencies. Let me highlight an example that we observed. A European bank acted on 104 key decisions in a single week. Normally, it would have taken them 4 months to do so. But even more impressively, the risk and compliance teams that audited the actions immediately after did not find a single error. I could come up with a large number of similar stories, but all of them have one thing in common. The companies we researched have experienced the benefits of a new way of working. During this international research, we analysed the reaction to COVID-19 of more than 50 companies with different agile maturities. We found that the more mature agile companies were much better able to respond when the crisis hit. For example, we found that one European bank tasked cross-functional teams to deploy new online services. They did so in a matter of days. Just setting up the teams could have taken weeks before the agile transformation. But in this case, the bank was ready to act and to let the team make the decisions it needed to. On average, we found that companies that were more agile than their non-agile competitors. We found similar trends also within companies. Agile business units were much better able to cope with changes such as the transition to remote working than areas of the business that had not yet undergone an agile transformation. Executives we spoke to emphasized that the agile teams have continued their work almost seamlessly after the pandemic shock, without substantial setbacks in productivity. They have been literally able to virtually co-locate. In contrast, many non-agile teams struggled with the transition, struggled to reprioritize their work and be productive in the new remote setup. Going back to our research with resilience first, I'm now going to walk through the common practices that we found in the interviews and the lessons that all organizations can take from them. Please can we transition to the next slide? The first shared practice we found was that organizations established a simple common purpose that was applicable to the whole company and shared this with employees with clear communications. This helped engage and motivate employees and helped them prioritize competing demands. For example, a major UK grocer established 3 clear principles at the start of the crisis, such as being a safe place to work and shop. The 3 objectives helped to guide the company's response and establish what their priorities would be. The most effective organizations focused on more frequent communications of their common purpose, taking an adult-to-adult tone that explained decisions and shared a realistic assessment, with this transparency helping employees feel closer to the company and more invested in its success. Agile organizations, or those with greater adaptive capacity, often speak of a shared purpose and vision, the North Star, which helps people feel personally and emotionally invested in the organization. One lesson or takeaway for the next normal could be that organizations can take the opportunity to look again at their mission and purpose and consider if they can make it clearer and ensure it gives people the ability to act and make decisions. Ideally, they should make it specific and personal for employees so that it truly speaks to them and would genuinely allow them to make choices between 2 different paths. The second shared practice we found was that organizations stood up new forums and structures or repurposed existing ones to act as rapid decision-making bodies. These often began life as crisis management forums, composed of very senior people, and met regularly, often daily at the start of the pandemic, to take decisions and reallocate resources quickly. These new structures allowed organizations to cut the usual red tape and management layers, which sometimes led to slow and laborious decision-making pre-pandemic. For example, Intel used their decision-making forums to quickly shift employee focus and resources towards sectors that have become higher priority in the pandemic, such as government clients and healthcare. One lesson for organizations might be to try and move away from big periodic bets and towards quick, continuous decision-making. Agile organizations emphasize this quick, continuous decision-making, preferring 70% probability now versus 100% probability later. This also means Agile organizations don't seek consensus decisions. They take input from all team members, prioritizing those who have the most expertise. But once the decision is made, all employees are expected to get behind enacting those decisions. The third common practice was creating networks of local teams and ensuring clear role accountability. Lots of companies moved their focus towards local business units, trying to push decision-making down to these teams rather than have all decisions made centrally. This often meant senior leaders were much more closely linked up with operational leads, with the role of middle managers often less important in making some of these quick, necessary decisions. We often see Agile organizations replace a lot of the traditional management hierarchy with a flexible, scalable network of teams. To benefit from this in the next normal, businesses could do an assessment of their organization to understand where cross-functional teams could be more effective. For example, are there particular customer needs or products that could be better met through a small cross-functional team? The fourth common practice is empowering frontline employees. Many of the companies we spoke to encouraged their operational staff to take on opportunities that they saw as a result of the pandemic. For example, at Intel, they encouraged staff to work on projects such as the Ventilator Challenge, or a number of employees felt empowered to work on design for new PPE. This even led to an employee obtaining a patent for PPE for hospital staff. One lesson that organizations could take from this is to find ways to formalize these processes that allow frontline employees to bring their ideas to leadership. For example, this could be as simple as having a regular no-agenda coffee chat set up between execs and their teams that allow employees to bring forward new ideas in a low-pressure environment. Or organizations could set up informal innovation competitions where employees can present their ideas to senior leaders and compete for the chance to be given funding to pursue them. And finally, enabling technology. We all realise just how much we've relied on technology to allow so many of us to work remotely for the last few months. In fact, this webinar is a great example of it. Many of your companies will have invested very quickly in laptops and other remote working technology. Agile companies often look to embed and integrate technology so that it is core to many of their processes. Companies could follow this by identifying current pain points where technology could help the organization. For example, improved data visualizations or informal communication channels to help teams collaborate. For example, at McKinsey, we've brought in Slack, and I found it incredibly valuable for being able to maintain quick communication between team members that normally we'd have from sitting side by side. So to recap, the 5 Agile characteristics that we found through our research and interviews and that led to greater resilience for companies were a common purpose and clear communications, structures that enable rapid decision-making, networks of local teams with clear accountable roles, a culture which empowers people, and finally, technology that enables all of the above. In the panel session that follows, you'll have the chance to hear from our panelists, and no doubt they'll expand upon many of the examples I've given and add more of their own. So to conclude, a number of organizations have undergone agile transformations and are seeing the benefits. The benefits are the reason why people are so excited about agility. And these do include greater resilience, yes, but also quicker, better decision-making, flatter, non-hierarchical structures, empowered frontline employees, and a greater focus on the customer. We'd really love to have a conversation with anyone on this webinar who's interested in what we've been discussing and wants to find out more. Thank you for listening, and we're really excited about the potential that agility has to unlock so many benefits for your companies. And we would love to hear your views and experiences in the Q&A session and also in conversations afterwards. I'll hand back now to Christopher to chair the panel discussion.
Fantastic, thanks, Elena. And if I'll invite my fellow panelists to turn their video cameras on, and we can kick off the discussion. Let me first introduce the panelists. So joining us today, we have Alan Brown, who's the Group Security Director at Tesco. We have Hank Cole, the Hank Cole, the Global Head of Business Continuity and Incident Management at HSBC. And then also, finally, Brian Staton, the Head of Distribution Capital Delivery at UK Power Networks. Hi, everyone. So let me kick off with the first question. Interested to hear how you would summarize in each of your own companies both the historic level of agility in your business and how did you find that change during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic? And maybe Brian, maybe you could start with that one.
Okay, could we bring the slides back up again, please? Thank you. So apologies for having a couple of slides for a question, but I thought it was probably a good way of introducing who UK Power Networks are. I think you'll probably be very aware of Alan and Hank's companies, but for us, UK Power Networks, we are an electricity distribution company. We are one of 7 in the UK, which effectively take power from national grid and distribute it down to end customers. So for UK Power Networks, we serve London, East of England and the South East of England. We've got 8.3 million customers connected, and we serve roughly a population of about 20 million people. One of the ways we do that is by what we call wires in the ground or wires in the air. That's effectively the means we achieve that. If you put all of our wires together for just our region, it would actually take you around the planet 4.5 times, just over 4.5 times, give you a perspective of that. The vast majority of our network is actually underground. About 75% is cables in the ground, but we've got about 25%, which is what we call overhead lines. And I think it's the overhead lines which give you some degree of the agility we have within our business to be able to cope with what we quite often have is bad days. The network itself, overhead lines, are susceptible to severe weather events, particularly high winds and lightning. And I just wanted to illustrate there with the table on the left-hand side at the very top. On a general average day for us in UK Power Networks, we'd probably see about 8,000 or 8.3 million customers would lose power. A couple of weekends ago, end of September, we had a storm just in the sort of tip of Norfolk, and that actually took off 134,000 customers, and that was in the space of probably 4 to 5 hours. So we go from a normal day looking after about 8,000 volts to sort of a space where we've got, several 100,000 off. And you can see from, taking you back to St. Jude's in 2013, we had, well over 600,000 customers off. So we as a business, our sort of agility is very much around how do we obviously manage the core days and do that very well, but also be able to expand and be very agile for the days when we have storms coming through. And bear in mind, for us, storms are not generally known when they're coming, where they're going to hit, and how much damage they're going to cause. The second one from that, you can just look, I'm not going to go through the whole table, but the second area for customer calls, we generally have about 1,200 calls in a day. So the storm in September, we had nearly 16,000 calls came through within the space of about 12 hours. So there's a lot of things we've learnt as a business really over the last 10 years of how we improve our agility in these events. A lot of that's around all of our staff having joint roles. They have a normal day-to-day role, but they also have what we call a storm role, and they're trained to be able to react in emergency and take on those roles. We also do rely on a lot of our key contractors to help us as well, and suppliers. But I just want to share that with you as a sort of introduction for us. I guess moving on more to the COVID and the lockdown, I think if we're all being sort of brutally honest, even though we put a lot of planning into the sort of pre-COVID situation, I think we're all probably not quite clear about where that would lead us during the lockdown. And I think there was a lot of rapid decisions we had to make in that first sort of 7 days to be able to really come back stronger than we did before the event. I think one of the things we've already talked about is we actually put a lot into our IT infrastructure. We'd already spent the best part of a year making available, the ability for most of our office staff to work from home, and that was greatly used. We go from very few pre-COVID to we had over 3,500 of our employees working from home, working very well. I think that the area where we probably dropped a little bit was in the operational resilience. We couldn't do everything we wanted to in that first period, more because we didn't really understand the sort of ramifications, be able to work effectively through the COVID period. What precautions would we have to take? Do we have the right PPE? So there's all those things actually, I'll probably say the first 4 or 5 weeks actually reduced our agility, but certainly we came back from that. So that would be my sort of general answer to that question, Chris.
There we are. Thanks very much. I think Hank has dropped. So maybe Alan, could we pass over to you? It'd be great also to hear from Tesco, sort of how you think about agility historically and how that's shifted over the last 6 months or so.
Okay, I might take a slightly longer look than 6 months, if I may, Chris.
Absolutely.
So one of the questions that I was asked when I transitioned from the public sector to the private sector was, well, what's the difference? And the difference very clearly was at that time agility. Tesco, huge organisation, but had the ability to almost turn on a sixpence, incredibly agile, and looking at the characteristics that Elena set out, many of them were present to enable that to happen. And what we saw, though, in the intervening period between then and now, or the last year, was an incremental level of governance, which really slowed the organisation down. It may have given it perhaps more certainty, but actually really slowed some of the dynamism and some of the decision making to the point of where the business was nowhere near as agile. And what we saw really as a consequence of COVID and the challenges that it presented to us was a return to the agility that we had maybe a decade ago, where the decision making was really put into the hands of our crisis management team. It had very clear set of principles to achieve the objectives of the business, which didn't change. The principles in terms of the priorities may have done or did do, but it re-established that common purpose. It was really clear to colleagues. The structures that it set up were really dynamic. It invested a lot in people's decision making. It set a framework for people to work within. But gone was that classic decision making, which was forever seeking different views and going back out to consultation and slowing decision making and progress down. So we saw really a return to many of the characteristics that were very prevalent within the business a decade or more ago, and it's breathed a breath of fresh air in many ways into the business. Huge dynamism now. Morale is excellent, and there's a real belief that that actually we could really make a difference, and that colleagues can really make a difference, and that has engendered a virtuous circle. So, you know, all of which is a very positive thing. I'm sure that we will return as we eventually get back to whatever the new normal is going to be, to slightly more governance. But I think the lesson very clearly is there: the dynamism of decision making, the inclusion of people, making sure that success is celebrated by everybody, really creating that virtuous circle has really enabled the business to thrive in the most difficult of scenarios.
I love that, and that really reminds me of actually when I speak to a lot of companies who talk about both agility in general, but the experience through COVID of enabling them to recapture something that, you know, they either saw in the past when they were smaller or in a different age. That really strikes a chord. Hank, maybe over to you. It'd be great to hear a little bit about HSBC and how you historically have thought about agility in relation to your organization and how that's evolved over the last months.
Yes, thank you very much, and apologies in advance if my internet connection isn't as good as it should be. I think most large multinational companies would assume that they're quite agile. I think at a departmental level and a business unit level, I think we have been quite agile in the past, and we practice that both from an exercising of business continuity plans and practicing from a crisis management or major incident management perspective. Where I think we perhaps lacked agility and are now in the process of developing it is bringing all of those processes together. So when you're forced into a situation where at site level, country level, regional level, and globally, you're having to invoke both the business continuity plans and the incident management planning at the same time, that's when you have a true test of your ability to adapt and be agile. I think the second thing I would say is that this is very people focused. So the difference between practice and reality is quite stark. I remember well managing the fallout and the impact of the earthquakes we had in Mexico, which happened to fall on the anniversary day of the 1985 earthquake, which meant that we had a government-wide exercise at 11 o'clock in the morning where a lot of our stewards and managers performed admirably in an exercise scenario. And then unfortunately at 10 past 1 in the afternoon, when the world shook for good, some of those people didn't perform particularly well. And I think that comes out in any crisis, and being agile enough to move people around according to their ability in a crisis is key. And I think you know, to the points that made by Elena and other people earlier, the ability to bureaucracy bust out of necessity is really important. So bringing down the cycle of change from what would take months and years
I think we may have lost Hank there, but
is to post-incident and the ability to make those changes at pace, and in most cases to make the right decisions, is something that needs to become part of the DNA of any company, not just an ability that you bring out at crisis time.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and I think in many ways, during a crisis, these ways of working and these traits are the natural go-to. But the real question is, how do you make that more the norm rather than the exception? Alan, maybe back to you. It'd be great to hear if you could share any specific examples from during COVID crisis around how your organization became more agile, or sort of demonstrated different ways of working.
Yeah, sure. There are many actually, but some of the more sort of staggering ones, I suppose, would be a sort of assessment of how COVID would affect the numbers of people who may have to self-isolate because of their vulnerability. And we quickly realized that the numbers were really very significant and had the ability to disable the business to serve customers and meet its objectives. And that led us very quickly to make a decision where we were going to recruit 45,000 people, and actually managed to do that in a period of 10 days overall. And that brought with it huge challenges in terms of making sure that they were appropriately trained, making sure they were appropriately equipped. Yeah. And that required, the cross-functional teams to be able to work together, to recruit, to be able to train, to be able to equip, and for them to then be able to make their contribution to the business. That's on a grand scale. On a slightly sort of smaller scale, we closed a number of departments within stores, primarily because we realized they created a situation where customers were having to queue. We realized that they felt very uncomfortable about that. So a decision was taken to make sure that stores were as safe as they possibly could be, and that was very clearly how customers would view them. So we made the decision that we were going to close our sort of fresh meat and fish counters, and make sure that the colleagues there were able to focus on the priorities within the stores. So on a grand scale and on a slightly smaller scale, we made some decisions that really were so significant to the business that if we made them pre-COVID, we'd be still talking about them now, and still trying to recruit those people.
And how was it that you were able to take those decisions so much more quickly than in ordinary times, as it were? Like, how did you achieve that?
Well, it's very much down to the structures that we had in place. So we have a well-rehearsed crisis management approach. It's pretty classic in its establishment. It's gold, silver, bronze, and we were clear about what the objectives were. The information came into the crisis management team. The decision was taken there. People were empowered to actually deliver those decisions without having to go through, coming back for consultation. Well, maybe we should do it like this. Maybe we need to get some due diligence on this. So all of those kind of bureaucratic processes were put to one side, and it was very much focused on delivery. But the key issue, I suppose, is the crisis management team had the ability to override the other bureaucratic decision-making forums that existed.
Right. Brilliant. Very good. Very insightful. Brian, maybe over to you. Are there any examples that you could share from UKPN?
Yeah, sure. I think in the early stages, we were really quite concerned about having sufficient operational staff to be able to do their, the basic things, keeping the lights on, dealing with sort of critical safety functions on the network, and also dealing with quite a few new connections in relation to COVID, including the new Nightingale Hospital, which we had to provide power for. So one of the things we decided very quickly was that communications was absolutely key to get right out to the workforce, to stop any sort of rumours being pertained in the organisation. So our chief exec, he'd already been doing what we used to call Basel TV. It's sort of once a month for team briefs. He started doing a brief every day, right through sort of the main part of COVID. So a 10-minute video to all staff that they could see what's going on, hear from the top guy in the company, what's being discussed, what's happening, from government-wise, how we've reacted to that, what's our rationale for doing and making certain decisions. And I think that really had a big impact on the employees. He also, in relation to that, had these sort of live, what we call yam jam sessions, which any of the staff could fire questions at him. So it wasn't just a one way, and that was really quite powerful as well. I think the second one I'd probably raise is that we took a sort of an early decision as well around involving our staff representatives on our instant leadership team. It's something we've never done before, but we thought, well, they're part of it. They can give us instant feedback on what we're discussing, and that allowed us to do some quite rapid decision making. And in sort of virtually within an hour, we could agree something which, like Alan, would have probably taken weeks and weeks to agree before. So that's been really powerful. And say we have slimmed down those meetings now in the videos. We're certainly only going to one instant leadership team a week. We've got it straight after this this webinar today. And also one observation I'd make about the videos and the sort of communications piece, when we discussed it last week on Resilience First, is that it's getting the right balance. There was so much was related to COVID that I think we probably didn't have enough balance about safety and other bits. So that's one learning we've certainly taken in for the second wave.
Brilliant, thank you, Brian. I'm not sure if you can hear us, but any examples you'd like to share from HSBC? I think we may have lost Frank. Maybe yes, Alan, I'll go
wonder
back.
If you can hear me, I'm trying to make sure that you can.
Hank, I think we can hear you. Go ahead.
Sorry, can you hear me? I apologise.
Yeah, we can. Take it away. We're saying if there's any examples from HSBC of adaptability, resilience, and agility through the COVID-19 crisis. No, I think we've lost Hank. Well, so let me take it back to you, Alan. You described, I think, really well how the crisis management infrastructure had allowed you to take decisions much more quickly, to do some extraordinary things. Interested in now we're a little bit further on, still very much not out of the woods, but a bit further on. How has this evolved inside of Tesco's? Are there any features of bureaucracy busting that you described that you're starting to bake into core operating model?
Interestingly, I suppose we went from a situation where the crisis management team had primacy in decision making, and as we thought the situation had established, become more stable towards the July-August period, we started to collapse the crisis management team back into the various UK leadership team or the Central European leadership team. But interestingly, as we've now got towards a second wave, we've now reinstated those. So we've kind of gone from a situation where we were folding it back into business as usual. And yes, we were all attracted by the idea of becoming more dynamic in our decision making and trying to remove duplication and having a sensible level of consultation around decisions, to one where we are now back to the crisis management team has primacy around its decision making certainly for the UK and the Republic of Ireland, and a similar situation actually across all of the geographic areas. So we've gone back with an ambition to try to incorporate some of the changes, but actually the circumstances have meant that we haven't been able to maintain that, and we've reverted back to our crisis management team approach. It'll be interesting to see how that fares as we come up to a really critical point of the calendar within retail, Christmas or Halloween and Christmas, and then of course also Brexit is placing, or has the potential to place, some interesting demands upon us as well. So some interesting dynamics playing upon how our decision making will take place.
And a few interesting questions coming in on the chat. One from Rob Worley, which maybe builds on what you were saying about, often times when we think about crises, they're days, weeks, not months, or hopefully not years. And that inevitably, one would imagine, takes a toll on the individuals on crisis management teams and also broader organization, employees across the organization. It'd be great to get your perspectives, and maybe Alan, you first, and then can go to Brian, on sort of whether you've seen any challenges in this regard and how you kind of thought about being in this for the long haul.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, because most crises are reasonably contained, and they're able to move from that critical phase into getting back to a normality. The real challenge here, of course, is that normality may be a year off, if not even longer than that. So effectively, you're trying to cope with a new normality. Yeah. And it was some of those resilience issues, those personal resilience issues, which persuaded us to try to fold our response back into a more business as usual approach, because there is no doubt that the pressures of constant change and the decisions that go along with those really do take their toll of individuals. And we've had a real effort running alongside as well to make sure about the well-being of colleagues throughout the organisation. Actually, colleagues in stores face all sorts of difficult challenges. They've been there throughout the virus, and those people who are kind of making the decisions and running the business, and including they've been at the hamster wheel for a very long time now. Yeah. And so making sure their well-being is absolutely considered, and it is a factor. I'm not saying we've got it right by any means, but we do acknowledge that as a real challenge.
Thank you. Brian, maybe moving to you, interested to hear your experience, the theme of transitioning from crisis management to embedding maybe new agile practices into business as usual sustainability for people in the organization. Great to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned already about certainly the IT sort of answers we've made in given remote working. I think that's something if you had asked our executive team, even probably 2 weeks into the crisis, would they see people working from home, long term? I think probably the answer at that stage would be no, but we have got a completely different mindset on that now, and I think it's been proven to work. And I think also, quite importantly, which is the key thing we always worry about, and I've touched on quite a bit already today, is how can we respond in a crisis like a storm event? And what we have been able to see is that some of the critical resources around call taking and dispatching work can be done from home. It doesn't need someone to be in an office. So I think that's not only increased our agility, probably moving certainly into the winter months, but it's given us more resilience in terms of numbers of people we can call upon, and as I say, that be that more agile in the future.
Fantastic. And then maybe building on this theme of technology that you mentioned, and that there's a question in the chat from Jean Devlin about this as well. And Hank, I might try and address this one to you, but this is a question around whether you see an evolving, changing role for technology, for example, leveraging data analytics for crisis management, as we think about both crisis management, but also sort of agility in organizations in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've gone from a situation of having a workforce fundamentally focused on an office-based approach, and obviously in a bank, you need to have certain assets open, like branches, for instance. Although we're reducing that footprint, but I don't think, as others have said, I don't think anybody envisaged having 230,000 people working from home simultaneously, and the tech infrastructure that we put in place to set that up, we will maintain to give us that flexibility in the future. I think in relation to how agile we are around crisis management in general, we need to be able to have genuine decision makers in those crisis groups, and we need to be able to stand them up and stand them down appropriately, so that you don't carry on with the same cadence of meetings just because you've put it in place. In terms of data analytics, we've done some really interesting work around, particularly on our sort of offshore sites in India and elsewhere, that now allows us to, person by person, assess what critical process they work on, where they are geographically, who their internet service provider is, et cetera, which means that we can very quickly shift our focus and shift our people, whether that's the work or the people themselves, from critical process to separate critical processes within the same city, within the same country, or indeed inter-country. And that level of granularity around who's doing what and where and how critical it is something that we will keep well beyond.
Very good. Thanks, Hank. Hey, a question from Robin McLaren in the chat, and I think I'll address this one to you, Alan, but it's an interesting question around how much or to what extent you think it's possible to pre-plan for some of these high impact, low probability events versus potentially sort of having the operational systems, the adaptability to adapt as and when they come along. So how much can you plan in advance for some of these things?
Very good question. We, perhaps like most large businesses, had a pandemic plan, and it sat there on the far right of the government's risk register. And all I can say is, as the owner of that plan, it was woefully inadequate to what the reality actually turned into be. It did help us, it did provide a foundation or a starting point, but I think what we really need is a generalized approach that's going to support those plans. No plan survives contact with the enemy. It has to change. And it's about having those structures in place that are sufficiently dynamic, are sufficiently flexible, being able to know who the right people are to get around the table to be able to solve the particular issue, I think is important. And being very quick to understand what are going to be your key sources of information to let you know what the situation is. And then when you've decided what the situation is and you've put your plan in place, to work out, is it actually being successful? What's the data? What are the metrics that you're able to gather to be able to help inform, whether you've got it right, whether you need to adjust? There's an extremely good book in terms of decision making called Sitting in the Hot Seat, maybe a little bit dated now, by an academic by the name of Rona Flynn. And she sets out decision making at critical times as being a bit like one of those Rolodex, where you quickly go through it, you decide, but actually you then need to verify, was that the right decision? And you need to do that quickly to be able to give you the confidence to continue. Because if you don't, you really have set off down the wrong track, and the crisis is still building up. So having having a plan that's going to give you a foundation, I think, is really important. If it meets and sustains contact with the enemy, great, but the likelihood is it won't. You need those processes in your crisis management approach to be able to add support and take it on from the foundation.
Yeah, and that also really resonates. And thinking about agile organizations, one of the features I see is that they need to have mechanisms to kind of check the quality of decisions at pace to enable a clock cycle to be maintained much faster in a sustainable way. That's one of those core processes. Otherwise, you can career to chaos. Brian, maybe a question for you from Sharon Walk here. Interesting question saying, during times when you have such intense focus on COVID response or other crises, how do you maintain situational awareness on other emerging risks that, you know, as at any time, potentially more so than other times, might arise?
Yeah, we certainly in UK Power Networks, we've been running for about four or 5 years now, a organisation resilience leadership team, and we kept that totally separate outside of COVID. There was a separate COVID call with the team, but the main thrust of the organisation resilience leadership team is to look at, you know, the emerging risks and other things we have to deal with. You know, we've been doing a lot of planning for Brexit, the storm itself, and I think also there's been a reference by one of the people on the call today about high impact, low probability events, which we have to plan for as well. So we have certainly not taken our eye off other risks, and probably more so, it's given us more of a focus on them, because we know if we had two events happening at once, we need to be able to cope with that and still do our day job fully. So it's probably sharpened everyone's focus in the whole of the business and to help on that.
Fantastic. So moving towards sort of the back end of our time, so maybe one final question for all of you. And Hank, I'll go to you first. But it'd be good to hear which of the new Agile practices or different ways of working that you've initiated during COVID-19 do you think your organization will want to keep and embed going forward?
Well, I think there's the obvious one, which is probably having larger proportions of our staff work remotely, whether that's at home or elsewhere, in a way that traditionally we haven't done at scale. So we'll certainly keep some of that. I think
Alan, you're on the hot seat sooner than anticipated, but same question to you. So which are there any practices, artifacts, ways of working that you think you'll want to embed at Tesco in the next month?
I think very clearly the same as Hank was saying, that the benefits that technology has brought us to enable colleagues to be able to work from home and give us that flexibility around offices, etc. I don't think we'll ever be returning to you've got to come into the office. I think people may have been a little bit concerned about what that might mean, but I think most people have thoroughly embraced it and see that there's real benefit in helping that work-life balance even more. And I think productivity has probably increased as a consequence of that. You know, that only really applies, of course, to our head office colleagues, because it's quite difficult to work from home when you're working in a store or a distribution centre. Now, the other things that we would really like to keep are, and I mentioned it earlier, really was making sure we get the right level of governance. So the governance is there to provide assurance that actually is not going to inhibit or hinder the decision making. So being able to return to things maybe that were there some time ago, that dynamism, that ability to see an opportunity and to grab it rather than have to go away and ask other people around it. So the development or the priming of that entrepreneurial spirit to be able to see those opportunities, to be able to take them, and you know, that's where we really want to be. We want to regain that dynamism that said Tesco, massive organisation, but it's not like an oil tanker that takes an age to turn around. Yeah. Actually, we're a bit like a Mini. We can turn on a 6 months.
That's brilliant. And Brian, maybe to close this out, what are your thoughts on that question? What would you like to retain in the next normal?
I think I would agree with Hank and Alan about the IT sort of flexibility. That's certainly a key one. I'd probably add another two. One would be definitely the involvement of our staff representatives on the leadership teams. That's been really really beneficial, and I don't see any reason why they should come away from that. And I think the third one would be what we have managed to do is, and it comes back to a question earlier about how do you keep running through lots of crises and keep everyone flowing. And we've done that by redundancy in training people. So we have, through this crisis, managed to get a number of other senior managers into that crisis management mode and understand, and they can drop in and take over when others are sort of diverted onto other crises. So I think it'd be those three for me.
Brilliant. Thank you. Alan, Brian, Hank, thank you all so much for joining the panel today. And to everyone who's listened, I mean, thank you for so many wonderful questions. We didn't manage to get through all of them, but hopefully we did a good few, and thank you to everyone for sending those in.
Thank you, Chris.
This has been a fascinating hour and covered a lot of ground. So on behalf of Resilience First and all the participants, I'd like to thank the speakers and the chair for their superb contributions today. We will be circulating a short summary in due course, as well as sharing the slides. And also we in McKinsey will be producing an easy to use guide on this topic for release at the end of the year, beginning of next. Finally, please do join our next webinar on the 21st of October on skills and resilience, an important subject as the furlough scheme comes to an end. So with that, I'll thank everyone again and stay safe and goodbye. Thank you.